welcome and happy Easter to all of you, rain or shine. It is wonderful to see all of you, and you all look so darn good today. I tell you, the women always look good, but there are a few guys who showed up in like coats and ties today, and I almost didn't recognize them. Thanks. Who are those guys out there? We know that today is more than a day to look good and to put on our best clothes and to celebrate and have a wonderful meal with our families and our friends. However, I do want you all to know that earlier this week I picked up my suit from the cleaners. I am wearing a brand new clergy shirt and collar that's probably lost on all of you. I wore my trendy hipster hat as I walked from my car parked across the street and strolled to my office. I polished my shoes last night. I have on my favorite pair of happy socks. And you better believe I'm going to enjoy a great meal this afternoon with my wife and my dad, and I'm going to celebrate. But today is not so much a day to celebrate and remember something that happened in the past, some 2,000 years ago. It's a day to celebrate a whole new way of seeing the world. It's a day to celebrate a whole new way of living in the world right now. Not in the past, but right now, today. Sounds good, right? I don't know. I'm not so sure about that. And I wonder, after I heard the gospel readings for today, I wonder how sure the disciples were that this was something to celebrate. You might have heard that the angel shows up at the tomb and says, "Don't be afraid." Jesus appears to the women again and says, "Don't be afraid." What the heck is everybody so afraid of? Shouldn't they be shouting hallelujah and jumping around? William Sloane Coffin, who was one of the great preachers of the last century, has a little bit different take in one of his Easter sermons on the disciples' reaction to the news that Jesus is back. He says they were obviously grief-stricken and heartbroken. Their hearts were aching and breaking with the weight that is so real and so physical when someone we love dies. And he said the horror of the crucifixion was still etched on their mind. And they were also probably weighed down by the fact that all of them, except the woman, were a bunch of cowards. And Coffin suggests that after all of that, they might have begun to be experiencing just a little bit of relief. A little bit of relief, that sense of relief that comes from the resignation of a long, hard struggle. You know, well, he won the hearts of a lot of people, but he didn't win the election. I wonder, too, if the disciples by that time were starting to think, you know, sometimes it was really hard work following that crazy guy around. Remember, he would drag us to those parties that he liked to have with those really weird people. You know, the outcasts and the sinners and the tax collectors and the prostitutes. They're just not our kind. And he would make us sit down at the table with them and talk to them and be with them. And he asked us to love our neighbor. That was challenging some days. And then he would tell us that we needed to forgive one another. And he said, you know, you just don't have to forgive someone once, but you have to forgive them again and again and again. And he kept sending us out to do all these crazy things like heal people who were sick and tend to the poor and bring hope and comfort to people whose lives were a mess. And he was always asking us to change the way that we saw the world, to change the way that we saw each other, because he wanted us to see the world and to see each other the way that he saw it. It was a lot of hard work. And, well, it's too bad it just didn't work out. And Coffin said that the disciples probably were thinking, okay, time to get back to the old fishing business. You know, let's start mending the nets, fixing the boats, back to business as usual. Let's go back to what's comfortable and what we know. And then they get the news. He's back. And he says, Coffin says their reaction probably wasn't hallelujah at all. But rather, oh no, not again. Not again. Here we go again. And yeah, here we go again. As Coffin says, of anything, Easter is far from being sentimental. It's rather difficult in a way. He says it's hard because Easter is more of a demand than a promise. It's a demand for loyalty for the one who didn't only live a long time ago, but lives today and asks us to follow in his footsteps. It's not about putting us back on our feet so we can do the same old thing over and over again, but it's about leading us into a fuller and a richer life, a life of change, and change is not easy. As Coffin observes, though, it was the resurrection that made Peter 10 times the person he was when Jesus had lived. But after the resurrection, Peter was a changed person. I was listening to a talk the other day by a guy named Shane Hicks. He's a writer, and he's one of the former pastors of the Mars Hill Bible Church in Granville, Michigan. It's that mega church that Rob Bell founded, and he was one of the co-pastors there. And he was talking about the resurrection, and he said two things that really have stayed with me the last couple days. He said the resurrection is about change, and the resurrection is really about a way of living, more than it is a way of believing. He said the resurrection is about change. It's about fundamental, substantive change. He sees this reflected, in fact, in some of those stories that we hear about the risen Christ. He notes how in the Gospel of John, Mary Magdalene sees Jesus at the tomb for the first time, and she thinks he's a gardener. What's with that? And then, do you remember that story in Luke's Gospel where the disciples are walking along the road to Emmaus after the resurrection, and they're walking with this stranger, and all of a sudden the stranger walks on and they go, that was Jesus. He sees these stories as a way of saying that the resurrection is about change. It's not about sameness. Something fundamental has changed. Things aren't the same. That's resuscitation. And Jesus is not resuscitating people, he's resurrecting people. He's changing people. And Hicks suggests that this is one of the big reasons he thinks everybody was so afraid. He's back. And he's asking people to once again change. Just the other day, I was talking to a friend of mine, an old friend, and she was asking me how everything here at the church was going in terms of getting ready for Easter and all those preparations. And I told her everything was great. I knew she had been kind of having a rough go, so I said, so how are you? And she goes, I am so glad that he is out of the cave because I want to go in it. We've all been there, haven't we? Somebody, out of there. I want in. I want to get away from it all. But the resurrection is about giving us strength to get the heck out of the cave, to get out of those relationships, to get out of those situations in our life that are stifling us and helping us to live in a new and fuller way. The resurrection is not about going back to business as usual. It's about going forward in life. You know, I don't know what cave, tomb you're tempted to crawl into, and I don't know what old ways want to lure you back to business as usual, but Jesus calls all of us forward in life. Shane Gibbs, like I said, also knows that the resurrection is more than an event from the past that people believe in. He says, really, it's a reality that's lived in. It's a way of living our life more than it is anything that we say we believe in. A theologian and philosopher and writer from Ireland, Peter Rollins, maybe some of you have heard of him. He was giving a lecture not long ago at a Christian school, college, Calvin College in, I think it's Grand Rapids, Michigan. And in the midst of his lecture, someone said, Peter Rollins, do you deny the resurrection?
No.
He stopped for a moment. And he said, yes. Yes, I do deny the resurrection. He said, anybody who knows me knows I deny the resurrection. Every time I do not serve my neighbor, he said, I deny the resurrection. Every time I walk away from someone who is poor and hurting, he said, I deny the resurrection. Every time I close my ears to the cry of those in need, he said, I deny the resurrection. Then he said, but you know, there are times, they're few and far between, but I do affirm the resurrection. I affirm the resurrection every time I stand up for those people who are forced to live on their knees. I affirm the resurrection when I weep for those people who no longer have any tears to weep. I affirm the resurrection when I speak for those who cannot speak for themselves. I affirm the resurrection, he said, every time I look in your face and I see Christ. I affirm the resurrection. The resurrection is about a way of life, more than a set of beliefs. Today, we proclaim Christ is risen. We're bold enough to proclaim that. Oh no, not again. As William Sloane Coffin says, yes, again and again and again and again. He is risen, he says. He is risen and calls us forward out of our caves and out of those ways that we're lured to go back to. He calls us into the light of a new day as changed people. And he beckons us to affirm his life-giving presence as we walk through this world with each other. So, my friends, today, give each other a big hug, tell each other Happy Easter, and shout Hallelujah again and again. Amen.